Jim LaPierre. This is Sober Now. Today's topic is getting back to basics. Streaming on a bunch of platforms today. SoberNow.com's Facebook page is one of the great places you can find us streaming. And if you haven't already been over there, please give it a quick like so you can get notified of future streams and content that we're putting out. Always good to be back with you. And very much welcoming your questions, your comments. What are you struggling with? What could you use some help with, whether it's on topic or not? Getting back to basics to me is the advice I most often give when folks are feeling overwhelmed. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, we just feel like it's all too much. Folks start talking about how I don't have time. I feel like I'm just barely holding on. I'm treading water. And quite often, we're anxious. We're feeling out of sorts. And it's really important to just be able to take that step back, get some perspective, and maybe start breaking things down when we're overwhelmed. Being able to fractionate and just take a look at what's going on from a different perspective, maybe get some outside input, can save us an awful lot of stress. The recovery skill here is to take pause, and instead of just continuously going at 100 miles an hour, take a step back, put things back in perspective, and bear in mind that there are things that always work. So when we're feeling overwhelmed, it's always a good idea to make the basic investments of hydration, nutrition, exercise, and sleep. It's always a good idea to reach out for support, which is an area that most of us struggle with. It's always a good idea to go to a meeting, to get together with your counselor, to get together with people in your support system, and just to take stock. Ask for what you need. As hard as that is, it's very simple. I've always appreciated the one sarcastic comment that I have found in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, this is a simple program for complicated people. I've met hundreds of people who thought they were complicated. None of that turned out to be true. Life, in my experience, is pretty simple. There's things that work well for me and things that don't. There's things that are healthy and things that aren't. But instead, when I support people in recovery, we tend to regress and revert to moral judgment. So we talk about what's good and bad. And we have a tendency to define things by what they're not. So if I ask somebody, how are you? And they say, well, not great. Okay. This is an example of times where we just need to get out of our heads, take stock, keep things real simple. The best way that I've found to do that is to ask myself, how am I doing? And I have to answer honestly. The next question is, what am I doing? Because quite often the answer is resisting powerlessness, doing things that are unhealthy for me, incurring stress that isn't necessary, or taking on things that are not my responsibility or my problem to solve. And so the follow-up question is, who do I need to involve in this? Because relying on myself is something that I used to justify as being independent, but the truth was it was simply the fear of reaching out, asking for what I need, and allowing myself to have enough vulnerability to both express that and to let people support me. Oftentimes, when we're overwhelmed, we get a case of the what-ifs. The what-ifs are anxiety-driven questions where we start thinking about all the things that could go wrong, and we start making plans and backup plans and contingency plans for things that haven't even happened yet. And we tell ourselves that we're being prepared when what we're really doing is taking away from today's serenity by anticipating things that may actually never come to pass. I always think of my friend Artis when I talk about going back to basics. Artis would say, no matter how good your recovery program is, no matter how well you are doing in managing your life, there's going to be times where, by no fault of your own, things get overwhelming. And so she would say to folks, you can always go back to step one. And when you go back to step one, you can separate what do I have control over and what don't I. And that having that in our perspective is one of the absolute keys to sustainability and manageability in our lives. Most of the stress that we incur comes from things that we're absolutely powerless over. We tend to rail against that. We tend to struggle. And what's motivated me, what's helped me over the years, is a lesson that I've learned hundreds of times, which is that there is something that I hate more than powerlessness, which is all of the stress and strife that I put myself through when I don't accept powerlessness. So going back to step one allows me to do very simple things like saying the Serenity Prayer, separating what can I do, what can't I, what do I need to leave alone, what is my responsibility to fulfill. It also allows me the opportunity anew to surrender to a power greater than myself. That's a place where an awful lot of us get hung up, especially in early recovery. The idea of surrender feels like giving up. It feels like all the fears of having faith in a power more powerful than myself. And I always say, what helped me to move past that fear was reconciling that whether I trust my higher power to take care of things or not, I still can't do anything about the things that I'm powerless over. So I quite literally have nothing to lose by the act of surrender. I'm always encouraging folks to bring things out into the open. If the only place that a problem exists is inside of my head, chances are it's going to become very circular, very fast. That hamster wheel is going to get moving, and I'm going to struggle to see solutions. When I bring it out into the open, I can do that as simply as by putting it on paper or on a computer screen. And even when things are going well, I make a habit of doing this. The more that I'm bringing things out into the open, I can list out what are my current responsibilities in the major areas of my life. So what are the responsibilities, deadlines, commitments that I have at home, at work, in different projects and hobbies, things that I'm involved in. And it allows me to map things out, if you will. It allows me to organize them. Organization and self-discipline are not things that come naturally to us, and unfortunately, they're often things that we rail against. To our downfall. I am not in any way by nature an organized individual. But what I've come to value increasingly is my time. And so in order to optimally use my time, I have to be organized. I have to use a calendar. I have to use a schedule. And none of those came very easily. But learning the value of new routines and habits is something that when I stop resisting it, I get to experience the benefit of it. So it's actually one of my pet peeves when folks tell me they don't have time to do things. I'll say, well, okay, we got 24 hours a day and 7 days in a week. So let's break it down. Where are you spending your time? How optimally are you using it? And are you organized? So even something just as simple as using a calendar, putting appointments on it, putting commitments down on it, reserving time for the people that matter the most and the responsibilities that need to be fulfilled. These very basic investments pay off in spades. The example I most often use around organization is as a young man, I started every workday pissed off because I couldn't find my car keys. And that is the most simple and most basic thing in the world. But before I made the investment of having a good habit, the disorganization and the chaos in my life was very apparent in my environment, and it made it difficult to start each day. So those little investments obviously have the capacity to pay off in spades. They usually require a fair amount of accountability. If I'm going to make a change in my life, I need to be talking to the people that support me and the people who hold my feet to the fire to make sure that that change occurs. Otherwise, it's too easy to let myself down. It's too easy not to follow through. A lot of things that I think are very basic. If you're not familiar with HALT, this is about as basic as it gets. HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired, and it works two ways. We can use it as a way to diagnose ourselves, what's going on with me, and ideally we use it as a preventative measure. So I don't allow myself to get too hungry, too angry, too lonely, or too tired. When I feel out of sorts and things don't seem to be working for me, I can simply ask myself, am I any of those things? And like so many things in recovery, I've come to appreciate that there's a deeper level to most every recovery lesson and adage. And so, for example, a lot of the things that we hunger for aren't food. A lot of the struggle that we have with anger is actually looking at the secondary emotion. A lot of the loneliness that we experience isn't necessarily isolation, it's not allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and connect to others. And of course, I hear from people all the time that they're tired, but what we often are is drained. And so when I think about basics, I think about the inevitability of the empty cup, the expression that we can't pour from an empty cup. We tend to be people who are far more comfortable giving than receiving. And so what I've learned the hard way is that constantly being of service to others is simply the most honorable way that I can avoid me. Basic is I need to be willing to serve myself, and I need to be willing to allow others to serve me. And I think that's the hardest piece for most of us. We're very comfortable giving, we're very uncomfortable receiving. We tend to be avoidant of self, which means that we lack an awareness of what our needs are. If we don't know what we need, we can't ask for it. And if we're not willing to accept vulnerability in expressing our needs and feelings, then it's going to be increasingly difficult to get what we need. Going to pause real quick. Would love to hear from you. What questions do you have? What's going on with your recovery today? How are things? Okay, folks are quiet so far, but would love to hear from you. More example of basics. Maslow's hierarchy. Maslow's hierarchy is about as basic as it gets. Maslow was a very smart guy. He organized human needs into levels of survival, living and health, and quality of life. And of course, folks tend to have an acute awareness when we're lacking the things that are key to our survival. But we tend to have much less awareness of emotional needs, much less awareness of spiritual needs. And the need to take stock is always evident. We're people who are well-versed in survival. It's especially through the course of our childhoods, through the course of active addiction. This is what became normative for us. But in the course of recovery, what we're looking for is to live, not survive. And we're looking to create a life that's so good we wouldn't want to mess it up by using or drinking. And so in order to do that, we have to tolerate the discomfort of moving outside of our comfort zone. We have to have a greater self-awareness. Just kind of checking in. I oftentimes will recommend step 10, the way it's described in the book, The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. It offers the practice of a daily inventory. So most of us feel like we do relatively well during the day, but when we lay down to sleep, that's when the hamster wheel kicks in. That's when we start thinking about the problems that we might face tomorrow. We start stressing or worrying about things that might go wrong. And so this is actually an alternative that's very practical. You can put it easily into place. Taking a daily inventory allows us to avoid what my friends in AA call the emotional hangover. So the excesses of yesterday's regrets, tomorrow's anticipated problems, and our propensity for taking on things that don't belong to us. When we take stock, we oftentimes find that what we're most concerned about or worried about might not even belong to us. We're people who have great empathy, and a lot of us identify as empaths. And empaths are beautiful people who tend to be very connected to the experiences, needs, and wants of others. But for as much as we have empathy for others, we often lack awareness and compassion for self. And so the process of taking a daily inventory is introspection. Introspection is taking stock, what's going on in my life, what's happening, more about looking in your heart than analyzing in your head. It allows us to identify new resentments that we've formed, and ideally to release those. Look for our part in those, to be more forgiving, and it allows us to not keep accumulating baggage. It allows us to see our part in things, and if we're wrong, then maybe there's something that does need to be addressed. Maybe we have caused harm today. But I think most of us, somewhere between feeling anxious and most all of us profess to be ADD, what we really are people who are struggling with an ongoing series of adjustments, because that's what recovery is. Recovery is continuously, ideally, growing, healing, learning, integrating. We have so much that needs to change, and we're usually in a hurry to do so. We're people who go looking for complex solutions and shortcuts. It may have taken us decades to get to this place where we're willing to change our lives, and now we'd like to be all better by Tuesday. And of course, nothing about that is manageable or sustainable. There's so much that we come to notice, so much that we identify that isn't working for us. And in a very real way, what we're learning to do is shift our perspective, change our way of thinking, and simply notice all the things that we do that aren't working for us. All of the things that we do that are self-limiting or self-destructive. All of the insecurities and inhibitions that are holding us back. The ways in which we overcompensate or hide our true selves. And of course, all of these are obstacles to continued growth and healing. Becoming progressively comfortable with self is a great goal. What it takes to do that, I think, is primarily the KISS system, the Keep It Simple system. I always preach simplicity. I think when I allow myself to keep things simple, I have clarity. I don't always like what clarity reveals. Sometimes I get to see that something is painful or disappointing to me. Excuse me. But when I have clarity, it allows me to see a clear course of action and the opportunity to cope with what I'm feeling. And this is a great opportunity to journal. It's a great opportunity to go to anyone in your life who meaningfully supports you. And just don't get hung up on the trust issue. That's where most of us get stuck. We can share parts of our experience. We can allow ourselves to express what we're feeling and what our goals are. And that really doesn't take an overwhelming amount of trust. I think we tend to view that in an all or nothing sense, and it's one more way that black and white thinking really does not serve us. So taking that daily inventory allows you potentially to set up some routines, allows you to have a spiritual practice, allows you to develop some habits that are conducive for recovery, that are good for our health. Our willingness to do the very basics of life mean the simplest of things, like I don't eat in drive-thrus anymore. I make sure that I do walk every day. I make sure that I always have plenty of water around. And it's not that I especially enjoy doing any of those things. I enjoy what they make possible. Manageability and sustainability are not sexy concepts. They're not exciting. They're not revolutionary things, but maybe they are. Maybe they're the foundation on which your life is built, your new life is built. And maybe the ways in which we relate to ourselves, to a power greater than ourselves, and the choices that we make on a daily basis are really the foundational pieces of recovery. Just the choice not to drink or use today is revolutionary and foundational. The choice to connect with people that inspire me, encourage me, and hold me accountable is foundational. So much of life is really basic, and yet it involves doing things that I don't truly want to do. I have never wanted to go see my primary care physician. I've never wanted to go see the optometrist or the dentist. And honestly, for much of my life, I lived as though those things were optional, and I lived with the false belief that if I ignored a problem long enough, then it would probably go away. So, the more I attend to the very basic responsibilities, the better things go. And the more that I accept that attending to those basics makes my life more manageable, it creates possibilities that otherwise would not exist. The idea that if I ignore something long enough, it'll go away is only true of good people and teeth, in my experience. Basics are things like looking for obligation. When there are people or situations in my life that I feel obligated to attend to, that's a resentment in the making for me. It's never worked well for me to believe that I have to do something, or in recovery, I often hear people say that they've got to. And I'll bring their attention to the idea that there's actually a very limited number of things that we have to do. Everything else is a choice. But one of the ways that we limit ourselves is by telling ourselves that we don't have a choice, when in fact we do. Oftentimes, the feeling of obligation extends to our families of origin, and we feel like spending time with people that aren't healthy for us is simply something that we have to do, and it's not. Moving away from that, breaking free of obligation, is never a small thing. It's something that we deserve a ton of support with. But increasingly, we have the awareness that it's necessary, and I always encourage folks to consider who externally. If we make commitments to other people, we will surely follow through on them. But at the same time, we're people who are loath to make commitments to ourselves. And so that is a problem in and of itself. We need to be able to set those small goals, make sure that we're following through, and not disappoint ourselves, not continue to let ourselves down. The way I'll say it to the folks I serve is you're going to be with you 24/7, 365, and if you were going to be with somebody else that often, you'd want to be on really good terms with them. So I think it's important to consider the ways in which we relate to ourselves, the catastrophizing we do, the self-doubt that we do, all of the things that make it unmanageable to maintain a positive attitude and a healthy perspective. So learning how to maintain that perspective and learning how to get it back when we've lost it are keys to recovery. The old adages ring true. It really is all in how you look at it. So how I look at it is how I look at me, how I look at my life, the connections and relationships and experiences that I have. And I think, honestly, most people go their whole lives without meaningfully examining that perspective and looking for what limits that perspective, what is harmful about that perspective, what are the biases and prejudices that I carry, and how can I become free of those. That too, I think, is inherently spiritual. The connections that I get to make with people in recovery, the connections that the people that my higher power puts in my path, have become very basic to my life. And the things that are so vital, so important, and so healthy are all things that I struggled to accept. They were all things that were uncomfortable for me at first. They tended to be very awkward. And honestly, the longer I live and work in recovery, the more I see that tolerating awkwardness creates a million possibilities all by itself. So I Uh, Happy to be a resource, completely free of charge. I would love for you to check out Sober Now's YouTube channel. About 125 or so videos there on different topics of recovery from substance use disorder, and by all means, check out our website, sobernow.com. We recently moved to a subscription service. It's cheaper than ever, more affordable than ever, under 15 bucks. Both of our programs, a home study program for those who are seeking recovery from substance use disorder, and a second program for affected others, for folks like me who have loved ones in active addiction, looking at how to best cope and live our lives when it feels like we should put everything on hold and just worry about our loved one who's in active use. So please check those out. Please connect with me. Would love to hear what's going on with you, and I'll look forward to joining you next week, same time. We're here at noon Eastern most every Thursday, and hope that you're taking excellent care of yourself.